The CEO followed an elderly employee who was working double shifts and asked for food. What he saw changed everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. And write in the comments where you're watching this video from. It's interesting to know our geography. The alarm clock shattered the stillness of the early morning, its shrill beep cutting through the darkness like a distant siren. Martha Williams' weathered hand emerged from beneath a thin, faded quilt, pressing the button with a slow, deliberate motion. Silence returned, but the day had already begun. She blinked at the ceiling, its plaster cracked with time and stories. The air was cool, the old radiator barely whispered warmth. She felt a familiar stiffness in her joints, a dull ache that greeted her every morning without fail. 63 years old, and her body carried every moment of it. The scent of weak coffee drifted through the air, brewed in an old, chipped coffee maker that had seen better days. Martha sat at the tiny kitchen table, its surface scarred and scratched from years of service. The light above flickered, a bulb on its last days, but she paid it no mind. In front of her, a simple breakfast, one slice of toast, dry and brittle, and a cup of coffee, black and thin. She sipped it slowly, savoring the bitter warmth more than the taste. The soft creak of a door caught her ear. She turned, her eyes softening as she saw her daughter, Linda, in the hallway, wrapped in a threadbare robe. Behind her, faint sounds of the grandchildren's gentle breathing drifted from their shared room. Martha gave a small, reassuring smile and lifted her mug. "Go back to sleep, baby," she whispered. Linda, her face worn with exhaustion from night shifts of her own, nodded, trusting her mother's word. Martha rinsed her cup, set it in the sink, and pulled on her faded jacket, its cuffs frayed from years of wear. She grabbed her worn leather lunch bag and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky still veiled in the deep indigo of pre-dawn. The street lamps buzzed overhead, casting pale circles on the cracked pavement. She walked with purpose, her steps steady but unhurried, her breath visible in the cold. She had walked this path for nearly 3 decades, through heat waves and snowstorms, through joy and hardship. The city had changed, grown taller and faster, but her route remained the same. The factory gates of Brighton Manufacturing loomed ahead, cold steel against the dim sky. She paused briefly, a habitual moment to gather herself, then swiped her ID card. The old scanner beeped lazily, and the gate groaned open. Inside, the cavernous space hummed with distant machinery, still at rest before the day's fury. Fluorescent lights flickered on one by one, illuminating conveyor belts and towering shelves stacked with supplies. The air smelled of oil and metal, a scent Martha had long since stopped noticing. Her workday began in solitude. She moved with the rhythm born from decades of repetition, inspecting machines, tightening bolts, cleaning residue from the rollers. The mechanical parts of the factory were predictable, dependable. Unlike the people who moved through it, she liked these quiet minutes before the world woke up, just her and the machines. The clatter of footsteps and distant chatter signaled the arrival of her co-workers. Younger faces, fresher bodies, but few with her endurance. Many had passed through under her guidance, trainees who learned the ropes from her patient instructions. Yet they rose above her in rank and pay. She bore it with dignity. A voice broke through the industrial hum, sharp and cutting. "Well, well, early as ever, Martha. Can't get enough of this place?" She turned, finding the all-too-familiar smirk of Todd Reeves. His crisp uniform and confident stride marked his authority he wielded with a mix of arrogance and cruelty. Todd was young, ambitious, and had climbed the ladder quickly. Too quickly. "Someone's got to make sure the floor's ready," Martha replied, her voice steady, calm as still water. Todd's smile thinned. "Yeah, but don't wear yourself out, Grandma. Hate to see you keel over on the clock." He laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. A few workers nearby glanced over but quickly looked away, their faces tight with discomfort. Martha felt the sting, but her expression remained composed. She had heard it all before. Jabs about her age, her place, her worth. She knew Todd's type, all swagger and no substance. Still, the words burrowed, adding to the unseen weight she carried. "Better get moving, Reeves," she said, turning back to her task. "Wouldn't want the real work to get ahead of you." His smirk faltered, but he said nothing, striding off with a dismissive wave. Martha exhaled slowly, her hands tightening briefly around the wrench before she resumed her work. The hours stretched long and punishing. The machines roared, and she moved among them, adjusting, assembling, lifting, sorting. Her body protested with every repetitive motion, but she pressed on, her will ironclad. She worked through her break, as always, eating a small sandwich from her bag in the shadows of the storage racks. By the time the buzzer marked the end of the shift, Martha's bones ached with a deep, hollow weariness. Yet, she did not leave. A new order had arrived late, and Todd, ever eager to push someone else into overtime, had requested she stay and help clear it. It wasn't really a request, it never was. The factory, once bustling, emptied until only the hum of machines and Martha's steady movements remained. She loaded boxes, stacked pallets, and swept the floor, her body screaming for rest. But the job wasn't done, and Martha never left a job undone. She didn't know that, from a shadowed vantage point, eyes watched her. A tall figure stood near the upper walkway, his hands resting on the cold railing. Seth Harris, the elusive CEO of Brighton Manufacturing, observed the lone woman below. He hadn't planned to be here this late. A last-minute audit had kept him. But what held his gaze now wasn't the factory's operations, but the solitary, aging figure working with a tireless resolve that stirred something in him. Suddenly, the sharp echo of footsteps interrupted the stillness. Todd Reeves entered the scene, his voice carrying the same condescending lilt. "Still here, Martha? Didn't think you'd last this long. Gotta hand it to you, old-timer. Real trooper." Seth's brow furrowed as he caught the tone, mocking, patronizing. Martha didn't respond immediately, just paused to wipe her forehead with the back of her hand, her breath heavy but even. "Work's gotta be done," she said simply. Todd chuckled, a grating sound. "Well, don't drop dead. Be a real mess to clean up." With that, he turned and sauntered off, leaving his echoing footsteps and silence in his wake. Seth felt his jaw tighten. He remained unseen, but something inside him shifted, an ember of discomfort igniting into something hotter. He had come here to review numbers and efficiency reports. But what he had seen instead was something those reports never showed. Martha, back straight despite the years, returned to her task without complaint. Alone, unseen, unappreciated. Seth stayed a moment longer, the clamor of his own thoughts louder than the machinery. Then he turned away, but the image of her, small, steady, enduring, followed him into the night, and it would not leave him. The factory floor was a cavern of steel and shadow, lit by the pale flicker of overhead fluorescence. Machines hummed, conveyor belts clattered, and the air carried the familiar scent of oil and metal. The workforce had dwindled to a single figure, Martha Williams. Her body moved with a measured rhythm, shaped by decades of labor. Her breathing was steady, though each motion of lifting, stacking, and sorting sent sparks of pain through her joints. But she pressed on. She always did. High above, unseen through the mesh walkway that overlooked the floor, Seth Harris stood motionless. He hadn't planned to be here, certainly not at this hour. His evening had been consumed by financial reports and productivity analyses, numbers and charts that told stories of profit and efficiency. Yet, none of those reports had prepared him for what he was seeing now. A lone woman, well past the age most would have retired, working long after everyone else had gone. The CEO of Brighton Manufacturing felt a strange dissonance. The numbers he had reviewed claimed the company's workforce was optimized, turnover low, morale acceptable. But what he witnessed below told another story entirely. Then came the voice, grating, smug, and familiar. "Still here, Martha?" Todd Reeves, shift supervisor, sauntered into view, his gait lazy with the confidence of a man who never questioned his place above others. "Didn't think you'd still be upright. What's keeping you? Pride? Stubbornness?" Seth's eyes narrowed. The flippant cruelty in Todd's tone scraped against something raw in his chest. Martha paused, wiping her brow with a sleeve darkened by oil and sweat. Her back was straight, her voice even. "Work's gotta be done," she said, the simple statement carrying the weight of her character. Todd chuckled, a low, hollow sound. "You're something else. But don't push too hard. Hate to be the one filling out an incident report if you keel over. Bad optics, you know." With that, he turned on his heel, the heels of his boots tapping a careless rhythm as he disappeared into the shadows. Seth felt his jaw clench, his fingers curling against the railing until the cold metal pressed into his palm. He stayed rooted for a moment longer, watching Martha return to her task with the same relentless resolve, the insult sliding off her shoulders, unseen but not unfelt. The numbers never showed this. They never showed her. The next morning, Seth entered his office, his usual sharpness softened by the residue of what he had witnessed. The skyline of the city sprawled beyond the wide glass windows, but his eyes rested not on the horizon, but on the document he had pulled from the internal employee database. Martha Williams. 30 years of service. No disciplinary marks, no complaints, multiple employee commendations, mostly from long-departed supervisors, and, he frowned, no promotions. No raises beyond the standard cost of living adjustments, no bonuses, nothing. Further down, he found something else, a series of recommendations for advancement, all blocked. Each one stamped with the cold authority of a manager's denial. The reasons were vague, position filled, overqualified, no suitable opening. But a pattern emerged. Each rejection coincided with the arrival of a younger, less experienced hire who had been promoted within months. Seth's frown deepened. The past decisions of his managers spoke loudly in their omissions. A memory surfaced, one that had been buried beneath years of boardrooms and business flights. He had been a junior intern, green and unsure, lost on the factory floor, unable to restart a jammed production line. The supervisors had been absent, the other workers too busy to notice his panic. But someone had approached, an older woman with gentle eyes and a steady voice. "Check the secondary feed sensor," she had told him. "It's always that one." And she had been right. It was her, Martha, all those years ago. The crackle of his intercom broke his thoughts. "Mr. Harris," said his assistant's crisp voice, "Todd Reeves is here for the morning briefing." "Send him in," Seth replied, his voice measured but cool. Todd entered with the swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. His neatly pressed uniform contrasted with the oil and sweat that had marred Martha's the night before. "Mornin', Mr. Harris," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. got the overnight numbers. Productivity was up slightly thanks to some overtime assistance. Seth didn't offer the expected nod of approval. That assistance was Martha Williams, he said, his voice level. The woman you mocked while she covered shifts meant for 3 people. Todd's grin slipped. Oh, I wouldn't say mocked. Just some light ribbon. You know how it is. She's a tough one. Seth's eyes, cold as glass, pinned him in place. And how long has this light ribbon been your management style? Todd hesitated, the confident facade cracking. Look, she's old school. Gets the job done, sure, but... Seth's voice was soft, sharp. Well, Todd continued, trying to regain ground, she's past her prime. We're trying to bring in new blood, younger energy. Besides, she's never asked for anything more. I figured she's comfortable where she is. Seth's knuckles whitened against the polished wood of his desk. She's never asked, he echoed, the words bitter on his tongue. And you assumed that meant she was content. Not that she knew she wouldn't be heard. Todd shifted, his confidence now fully eroded. I wasn't trying to be cruel. She's just not leadership material. She's the backbone of this floor. Seth interrupted, his voice cutting like steel. While you talk, she works. While you mock, she teaches. And while you sleep, she carries this company on her back. The silence that followed was thick, but Seth's mind was already beyond Todd. The shift supervisor was a symptom, not the cause. No, this was systemic, a rot that had been allowed to fester beneath the veneer of productivity reports and corporate platitudes. The rest of the day was a blur of inquiries. Seth requested Martha's complete personnel file, dug into her payroll records, and reviewed every denied promotion from the past decade. What he found enraged him, a pattern of age discrimination, consistent and undeniable. Behind most of those decisions, Todd Reeves's signature. But Seth didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, he dug deeper, into the company's policies, into the structure that enabled this neglect. He wanted more than a reprimand. He wanted change. As night fell once more and the office lights dimmed, Seth sat alone, Martha's file open before him. Her face, captured in an outdated ID photo, looked at him with the same calm, steady resolve he had seen on the factory floor. Not anymore, he murmured to the silence. You won't be invisible anymore. The numbers in his reports had lied, but he had seen the truth, and he would not forget. Morning crept through the towering glass windows of Seth Harris's office, casting soft beams across polished mahogany and pristine leather chairs. Yet the warmth of the rising sun did little to ease the cold knot of unease in his chest. The previous night's images lingered. Martha's solitary figure on the factory floor, Todd's smirk dripping with disdain, and the echo of her simple, unyielding words, "Work's gotta be done." Seth's fingers hovered above his keyboard before settling with purposeful weight. His first command was clear. Martha Williams' complete employee record from her first day to the present. Within moments, the digital file opened, a tapestry of decades reduced to cold numbers and brief annotations. He scrolled through her history, and the deeper he read, the harder his jaw clenched. 30 years of service. 0 sick days in the last decade. Consistently high performance reviews from every supervisor except one. No promotions. No raises beyond the standard incremental adjustments. No bonuses for productivity. No recognition for mentorship. Instead, he found a pattern. Recommendations for advancement from former managers that had been systematically overruled. Seth's eyes narrowed at the signatures on the denials. Different names appeared over the years, but one stood out more recently than the rest: Todd Reeves. The reasons listed for denying her promotions were vague to the point of insult. Position filled, not a strategic fit, lacks leadership potential. Yet the records showed the same pattern: junior hires, some trained directly by Martha, advancing past her within months. His stomach knotted with anger as he reviewed salary adjustments. Despite 3 decades of loyal service, Martha's pay was barely above that of some second-year hires. In contrast, Todd Reeves, who had only been with the company for 8 years, had received multiple performance bonuses and rapid salary increases. But there was something more that struck him, a line buried deep in the archived commendations. Critical in resolving production line failure during system test, March 1997. Quick action prevented a major shutdown. Supervisor Alan Kerr. Seth's breath caught. March 1997. He remembered it vividly. He had been a fresh-faced intern then, lost in the labyrinth of machinery and blinking consoles. The production line had jammed, alarms blaring, and he, frozen, panicked, could only watch as the output counter ticked toward disaster. Until a calm voice, steady and sure, had broken through the chaos. Check the secondary feed sensor. It's always that one. He had followed the advice blindly, and it had worked. Production resumed, disaster averted. His supervisor had later praised him, assuming it had been his quick thinking, but it hadn't. It had been hers. He never saw her face clearly that day, never learned her name. Until now. It was Martha. She had been there, unseen but vital, not just to the company but to his own career. Seth's intercom buzzed, snapping him back. "Mr. Harris," his assistant's voice chimed through. "Leslie Moore from HR is here, as you requested." "Send her in," he replied, his voice clipped. The glass door opened, and Leslie Moore, the head of Human Resources, entered. Her stride was brisk, her expression neutral but attentive. She was a veteran of corporate battles, accustomed to the politics of power plays and personnel disputes. "You wanted to review a personnel file?" she began, her eyes flicking to the open dossier on Seth's screen. "Yes," Seth said, his voice tight. "Martha Williams. 30 years in the company, and not a single promotion. I want to understand why." Leslie's brow furrowed. She pulled a tablet from her portfolio and synced it with the company's database. After a few moments of scrolling, she pursed her lips. "Martha Williams, factory floor, senior technician by tenure, but no managerial experience listed. That's likely why she's been overlooked. Our advancement policy heavily weights leadership experience." Seth's voice was cold. "She has trained half the people who now hold leadership roles. I'd say that counts." Leslie hesitated. "I agree, but it seems her supervisors consistently rated her low on leadership readiness." She tapped the screen and opened the archived reviews. Most notably, her current supervisor, Todd Reeves, has given her poor marks in team collaboration and initiative. Seth's knuckles whitened. "Initiative?" he echoed, the word bitter on his tongue. "She's been covering double shifts, training juniors, and cleaning up his messes without complaint. And you're telling me she lacks initiative?" Leslie's tone softened, sensing the undercurrent of anger. "I understand how it looks, Seth, but you know how the system works. Supervisors hold the most influence over advancement, and if a manager like Todd is deliberately stifling her—" She trailed off. "It's hard for HR to override without solid proof." Seth's jaw tightened. "Proof. Right." He paused, then fixed her with a sharp look. "Then let's get it. conduct a full audit of her performance records, and interview any employees she's trained over the past decade. I want to know how her peers and subordinates rate her leadership skills." Leslie nodded. "Understood. I'll start immediately." She turned to leave, but paused. "Seth, what's driving this sudden interest?" He met her gaze, his eyes flinty. "Because last night, I saw a woman carrying this company on her back while being treated like she didn't matter, and I realized we failed her." As Leslie departed, Seth's phone buzzed, a notification from the internal database. On a whim, he had requested Todd Reeves's managerial history. The file loaded swiftly, and with it, a cascade of performance notes and incident reports. One entry caught his eye. March 2020. Employee grievance. Anonymous. Complaint regarding verbal harassment on the factory floor. Alleged remarks of ageism and derogatory comments from Supervisor Todd Reeves. Resolution. Unsubstantiated. Case closed. Seth felt a chill. He scrolled further, finding more. Small, isolated grievances, always anonymous, always dismissed. The pattern was clear. Complaints muffled, voices ignored. And he knew without doubt that Martha had been among those voices. Silent, because speaking had brought no justice. The hours blurred as Seth worked, driven by an energy he hadn't felt in years. When the office grew dark and empty, he remained, surrounded by screens and documents, unraveling the quiet, insidious web that had kept Martha, and likely others, unseen and undervalued. Finally, he paused, his eyes burning from the screen's glow. The image of Martha's worn face, her steady hands, her unyielding spirit haunted him. He closed the file and stared out at the city lights beyond his window. A memory, unbidden, surfaced from years past, his father's voice, a lesson he had once shrugged off in his youthful ambition. "A business isn't just numbers, son. It's people. And if you don't take care of them, someday you'll look up from your spreadsheets and realize you're standing on nothing but ashes." Seth's hand tightened into a fist. The numbers had told him a story of efficiency and margins. But Martha had shown him the truth, the human cost of those numbers. He had seen the cracks. And cracks, left ignored, only widened. Not this time. Not anymore. The night was cold and heavy with the damp scent of asphalt and distant rain. The city buzzed softly in the background, a low hum of traffic and life that felt worlds apart from the empty streets Martha Williams walked. She clutched her old leather tote against her side, its strap worn thin from years of use. Her steps were steady, purposeful, but beneath them was a weight, the kind that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the life she carried on her back. Her shift had ended hours ago, but overtime was never a choice. It was a necessity. The extra hours brought in just enough to keep food on the table and the lights on. Still, her legs ached from standing, her back throbbed from lifting, and her hands, hardened from labor, felt raw from the day's work. She pulled her thin jacket closer against the night's chill. Winter was creeping in early this year, and her coat, like everything else, had seen better days. A car passed slowly on the opposite side of the street, its headlights sweeping across the cracked pavement. Martha barely noticed, her focus on the path ahead. The bus stop was a few blocks away. She always took the late bus, cheaper, emptier. She preferred the solitude. Behind the wheel of the car, Seth Harris kept his distance, his grip tight on the steering wheel. He told himself he didn't know why he was here, trailing her through the dark streets. CEOs didn't follow their employees home. It was a breach of boundaries, of privacy, but the scene from the factory still clung to him, the weight of it pressing until he found himself here, his car crawling at a pace that felt unnatural. His chest was tight with a gnawing guilt he hadn't expected to feel so deeply. Martha's steps never faltered. She crossed an intersection where the traffic light flickered uncertainly, then turned down a side street lined with aging storefronts, their signs cracked and neon letters long gone dark. She paused briefly at a small corner market. Through the window, the fluorescent lights buzzed over shelves of discounted goods. Inside, Martha moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew the value of every cent. She picked up a half-gallon of milk, a small bag of rice, and a can of beans. At the register, she counted out her payment with careful fingers, placing a few crumpled bills and a handful of coins into the clerk's palm. She felt the familiar knot in her throat as she watched the total ring up. When the cashier announced the price, Martha's eyes flicked briefly to the small loaf of bread she had placed on the counter. A hesitation, a pause barely longer than a breath, and then, quietly, she pushed the bread aside. "Not that one," she murmured softly. Seth watched from his car, the scene playing out through the window like a silent film. He felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. The woman who had given 30 years to his company, 30 years of sweat and labor, of training others who had long since surpassed her, was choosing between bread and survival. Martha left the store with her small bag of groceries and continued down the sidewalk. Her face betrayed nothing, but Seth could see it. The exhaustion in her posture, the fight in every step. She walked on, past shuttered storefronts and rusted fences, until she reached a small apartment complex, its brick facade worn with time and weather. The building was old, with cracked windows and a broken street lamp flickering weakly overhead. She climbed the narrow, sagging steps to the second floor and unlocked the door with a careful, practiced motion. Seth had parked across the street, the engine silent. He wasn't sure why he stayed, what he expected to see, but something kept him rooted. Through the thin curtains, he glimpsed the inside of her home. The apartment was small and spare, a place where every object had a purpose. A single mattress on the floor, no couch, no dining table, just a small crate serving as both. The walls were bare except for a few worn photographs, but his eyes were drawn to the two small figures who emerged from the shadows, a boy and a girl, no older than 6 or 7. Martha knelt between them, setting the modest groceries down. She opened the small takeout container, likely from the factory's cafeteria, and carefully split the portion between 2 plates, pushing them toward the children. The kids ate quickly, their eyes wide with hunger, but their faces lit with gratitude. Martha sat with them, her hands empty, her meal forgone. She simply watched them, a soft smile on her lips that did nothing to hide the sadness in her eyes. Seth felt his chest constrict, his throat tight with a foreign, unwelcome ache. 30 years of loyalty, and this was her reward. A bare apartment and a half portion of food she wouldn't taste. He thought of the reports he had read that morning, the denied promotions, the withheld bonuses. He thought of Todd's sneer, the way he spoke to her, and the way the company, his company, had taken everything she had to give and returned so little. A gust of wind rattled the loose metal sign above the building, the sharp clang cutting through the night. Seth's hand tensed on the steering wheel. He should leave. This wasn't his place. It wasn't his life. But as he turned slightly, ready to go, a small voice, muffled by the glass and distance, reached his ears. "Mommy?" the little girl asked softly, her voice light but heavy with something far too old for her years. "Are we going to have breakfast tomorrow?" Seth froze. His breath caught as he saw Martha's expression shift just for a moment. Her hand brushed through the child's curls and she smiled. It was a mother's smile, warm and sure, a fortress against the cold. "Of course, baby," she said softly, her voice steady as the earth. "I'll figure it out." But Seth saw it. The flicker in her eyes, the crack in the armor, the raw, unspoken fear that no child should ever have to witness. He felt something shift inside him, something sudden and irrevocable. This wasn't business. This wasn't policy or margins. It wasn't about efficiency or profits or the bottom line. This was wrong. The reports he read, the charts, the numbers, they were lies told in neat columns and percentages. But this, the bare floor, the empty plate, the promise spoken over the ache of hunger, this was truth. And he couldn't unsee it. The wind rose again, cold and sharp as it whipped against his car. He turned the key, and the engine came alive, its low growl filling the silence of the street. He pulled away from the curb, but the image followed him. The little girl's question, Martha's answer, and the unforgiving weight of a life that his company, his decisions, had allowed to wither. By the time he reached the edge of the district, his mind was racing ahead of the car, a torrent of thoughts and resolutions taking shape with a clarity that felt like fire. No more. He would not forget what he had seen. He would not let it stand. Because some debts couldn't be paid with a paycheck or a plaque on a wall. Some debts demanded something far more valuable, and he would repay it, no matter the cost. The sun was barely above the horizon when Seth Harris walked into his office, his steps brisk and his expression carved from stone. The night had offered him little rest. Sleep had been a battlefield of images, the cracked walls of Martha's apartment, the bare mattress, the children's hungry faces, and her voice, steady but weighted with the unbearable promise, "I'll figure it out." He couldn't shake it, couldn't bury it beneath the usual armor of spreadsheets and corporate detachment. His assistant barely had time to announce him before Todd Reeves swaggered into the office, carrying his usual air of smug confidence. "Mornin', Mr. Harris," Todd greeted, flashing a grin that reeked of self-assurance. "Got those productivity reports for you. Numbers are up thanks to some extra elbow grease from the night shift." Seth's eyes didn't leave him. "You mean Martha Williams." His voice was measured, but a hard current ran beneath the surface. Todd's grin faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he masked it with a casual chuckle. "Yeah, Martha. She's a tough one. Reliable. You can always count on her to pick up the slack." Seth's chair creaked softly as he leaned forward, his hands folding on the desk. "How long have you been her supervisor, Todd?" "Little over 3 years," Todd replied, his tone light, almost careless. "Why?" Seth's gaze was unflinching. "And in those 3 years, how many times have you recommended her for a promotion?" Todd's smile thinned. "Look, Martha's solid, don't get me wrong, but she's old school, doesn't have the leadership skills we need to drive the team forward. She's comfortable where she is. She's never asked for more." Seth's voice dropped, cold and precise. "You're telling me that 30 years of experience, of training half the supervisors under you, including yourself, doesn't qualify as leadership?" Todd's posture stiffened, his smile cracking. "With all due respect, Mr. Harris, leadership's more than clocking hours. It's about energy, drive, and—" "Energy?" Seth's voice sliced through Todd's defense. "She's covering double shifts while you leave early. Drive? She's holding this floor together while you mock her in front of her peers." He stood, the air between them taut and electric. "I was there, Todd. I saw how you spoke to her. I saw how you treated 30 years of loyalty like it was nothing more than a punchline." Todd's face darkened, his tone turning defensive. "Look, I was just keeping the crew motivated. A little banter. She's tough. She can handle it." Seth's eyes flashed, a sharp, dangerous light behind them. It wasn't banter, it was disrespect. And worse, it was policy. Your policy. You didn't just deny her advancement, you buried her. And for what? So you could parade younger faces into management to make your numbers look good? Todd's facade of composure cracked completely. "With all due respect, sir," he said tightly, his voice carrying the edge of defiance, "this company needs new blood. It's not my fault she's out of step with the times. She should have retired years ago." Seth's jaw clenched, but his voice dropped into something colder than anger, a lethal kind of clarity. "That's your problem, Todd. You think people expire like inventory. But let me make one thing clear. I built this company on the back of people like Martha Williams, and I will not let you, or anyone, treat them like they're disposable." A tense silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of what was left unsaid. Finally, Seth straightened, his tone final. "Effective immediately, you're suspended, pending a full review of your managerial practices. Your access to personnel decisions is revoked. You'll be contacted by HR for further proceedings." Todd's face paled, his bravado draining in an instant. "Wait, Mr. Harris, let's be reasonable. This is—" Seth's voice cut like a blade. "Reasonable would have been treating your people with dignity. You chose otherwise. Now live with it." Todd's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. His jaw snapped shut, his face a mask of barely concealed fury as he turned and stormed out, the glass door rattling in his wake. The silence that followed was stark, but Seth felt no satisfaction. This wasn't resolution. It was only the first crack in a foundation that needed to be torn down. He turned back to his desk, his reflection in the glass windows behind him a silhouette against the city. His hands found the folder marked Martha Williams, but he no longer needed it. The numbers, the reports, they had all lied. But the truth had been in her silence, in her labor, in her life. The intercom buzzed. His assistant's voice filtered through. "Mr. Harris, Martha Williams is here to see you." Seth's eyes lifted. "Send her in." The door opened slowly, and Martha stepped inside, her posture upright but her face marked with the weariness that decades had etched into her bones. She was dressed simply, her hands folded before her. Her eyes met his with quiet, guarded strength. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked, her voice even but cautious. Seth felt the rehearsed words he had prepared unravel. Apologies felt hollow, promises felt cheap. So, he did the only thing he could. He told the truth. "I saw you," he said, his voice steady. "Last night. I followed you home." A flicker of confusion crossed her face, followed swiftly by tension, her fingers tightening. "You followed me?" His next words came quickly, cutting through her defenses. "I saw the store, the apartment, your grandchildren." He paused, then added with quiet gravity, "I saw you split your meal so they could eat." Martha's breath hitched, her eyes flashing with something raw, anger, pride, and something closer to fear. Her voice sharpened. "I don't need your pity." Seth stepped forward, his voice firm but clear. "It's not pity, Martha. It's shame. My shame, because I should have seen you sooner, and because everything you've been through, should never have happened. Not on my watch." Her eyes, hard as flint, searched his face, looking for the catch, for the strings, for the lie. Finding none, her voice softened, but only slightly. "And what do you want from me now?" Seth's answer was immediate. I don't want anything from you. I want something with you. I've fired Todd from all personnel decisions, and I need your help to fix what he and people like him have broken. I want to raise wages, provide better support for our workers, but I don't want to guess at what's needed. I want you to help me make it right." Martha's lips pressed tight, and for a long moment the room felt suspended in her silence. She had spent years being overlooked, underestimated, discarded. Trust was not something she gave easily. Finally, her voice, worn but unbroken, found him. "And why now? Why care today when yesterday you didn't?" Seth's throat tightened, but his reply was steady. "Because yesterday I saw a number on a page. Last night I saw a person, and I will not let this company, my company, fail her again." Martha's eyes remained on him, weighing the depth of his words against the gravity of her years. And in the space between them, something shifted, small but real. She spoke, her voice quiet but certain. "If you're serious, we do it my way. We fix this from the ground up. No more decisions without listening to the people who break their backs to make your profits." Seth's reply was equally firm. "Agreed." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Martha allowed herself something unfamiliar. Hope. The air inside the boardroom felt thick, the tension nearly tangible as executives and department heads gathered around the long, polished table. The expansive windows framed the city skyline, but no one in the room was admiring the view. Seth Harris sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his eyes cold and unreadable. Before him, a stack of files lay unopened, records, testimonies, and the results of the internal audit he had ordered. To his right, Leslie Moore from Human Resources adjusted her glasses, her expression taut with a mixture of determination and discomfort. The findings they had uncovered in the past days had been damning, a web of systemic neglect and bias that had been woven through Brighton manufacturing for years. Martha Williams' case was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a larger rot. The murmurs in the room died down as Seth cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, was low but edged with steel. "The audit is complete," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "The results are unacceptable." A brief silence, then a cautious voice from the other end of the table. "With respect, Mr. Harris," said James Wilcox from Operations, "productivity numbers have been consistently strong. The bottom line," Seth's voice cut across him sharp and cold, "the bottom line has been built on the backs of workers we've failed. Workers like Martha Williams. 30 years of service, 0 promotions, denied raises, and deliberately suppressed advancement. And she is not the only one." He paused, letting the silence weigh heavy before continuing. "The audit uncovered multiple cases of age discrimination, wage stagnation, and harassment, all under our roof." His eyes narrowed, hard as flint. "Explain to me how that's a strong bottom line." The room shifted uneasily. Some faces turned to Todd Reeves's empty chair, the absence of the shift manager a clear sign of consequences already set in motion. Others exchanged wary glances, the ground beneath their comfortable hierarchies suddenly uncertain. Leslie's voice broke the tension, her tone factual but charged. "The testimonies we collected from the floor paint a clear picture. Experienced workers were repeatedly passed over for advancement opportunities in favor of younger, less qualified hires. In several cases, workers reported intimidation from supervisors for speaking up about unfair treatment." She paused, her eyes flicking up to meet Seth's. This wasn't negligence, it was policy, an unspoken but deeply embedded culture. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Seth let the silence stretch a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice a shade colder. That culture changes now. A cough, then another voice. James again, cautious but pressing. With respect, Seth, sudden shifts in policy could disrupt operations. Pay increases, restructuring, it's a significant expense. Investors, Seth's gaze pinned him, ice in every word. Investors will see that we invest in the people who keep this company alive. And if they have a problem with that, they can take it up with me. Because this isn't a negotiation. It's an order. A current of tension ran through the table. The authority in his voice was absolute, but so was the shock. Seth, known for his pragmatism and ruthless efficiency, was making a move that felt personal. Because it was. The meeting adjourned, but the echoes of his decree lingered in the air. As the room emptied, Leslie remained behind. She studied Seth's face, hard, resolved, but carrying something else beneath the steel. "You're going to face pushback," she said quietly. "From the board, from shareholders. They'll accuse you of being sentimental, of risking the company's stability." Seth's voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "Let them. I'd rather lose their favor than my soul." The changes began immediately. Wages for senior floor workers were increased, meaningfully, not marginally. A new advancement program was launched, prioritizing experience and mentorship. Emergency assistance programs for employees with families were introduced. But the most significant change came in the form of a new role, one created for Martha Williams, Senior Workforce Advocate. The title was new, but the mission was clear, to be the voice of those who had too long gone unheard. And from the moment Martha accepted, the floor began to shift, not from top-down orders, but from the ground up. Workers approached her, some cautiously, others with long overdue grievances. She listened, not with corporate detachment, but with the understanding of someone who had lived every word they spoke. Some of the younger managers resented her presence, seeing her as a threat to their unchecked authority. But when they tried to sideline her, they quickly learned that her voice now carried directly to the top. And Seth, true to his word, listened. The confrontation came one late evening when James Wilcox, flanked by two other senior managers, entered Seth's office unannounced. "This has gone far enough," James declared, his tone tight with frustration. "The raises, the programs. Do you realize the cost margins we're compromising? We've worked for years to streamline operations, and now you're upending everything." Seth stood from behind his desk, his eyes cold and his voice precise. "Yes, I am. Because the streamlining operations is what got us here. Padding numbers while our workers broke themselves for scraps. You want to talk about cost? Let me tell you the cost I've seen. It's a woman splitting a single meal so her grandchildren can eat. It's 30 years of labor repaid with a paycheck that barely covers rent. That is the cost of our profit, and I won't pay it anymore." James's voice sharpened. "You're risking shareholder confidence for one employee's sob story." The room chilled. Seth's eyes flashed. "No," he said, his voice like cut glass. "I'm ending a pattern that let people like you turn that story into business as usual. And if shareholder confidence depends on crushing the people who make this company run, then let it burn." The silence that followed was absolute. James's face was a mask of frustration, but he saw the immovable line in Seth's eyes. He turned stiffly, retreating without another word. The door closed, and Seth felt the weight in his chest. A burden, yes, but also something new. Resolve. The changes were not smooth. There were stumbles, resistance, and more than one heated confrontation. But through it all, Seth kept his course. And alongside him, Martha's presence became not only a symbol, but a force, grounded, unshakable. Workers who had long been invisible found their voices, and when they spoke, they were heard. Weeks passed, then months. Productivity, which the board had feared would collapse, instead began to rise. Absenteeism dropped, and as the culture shifted, so did something deeper: pride. Pride in a company that, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to those who built it. One evening, long after the offices had emptied, Seth found himself on the factory floor once more. The machinery stood silent, the lines at rest, and there, in the familiar solitude, he saw her. Martha, clipboard in hand, surveying the space with the eyes of someone who understood it better than any executive ever could. She turned at his approach, her expression even, but her eyes holding something warmer than before. "Place looks different," she said. Seth nodded. "It's better," he replied, "because it's finally yours." For a moment, Martha said nothing. Then, with the smallest of smiles, she replied, "No, it's finally ours." And in that space, where steel and sweat met heart and history, something long overdue settled into place. The winds of change had blown through Brighton manufacturing, and they had left behind something stronger than profit, something built to last. The factory floor buzzed with attention unlike any other morning. The usual industrial hum seemed charged, every worker, every supervisor sensing that something was about to shift. Whispers passed between stations, half-formed questions hanging in the air. Rumors had been spreading for days, about meetings behind closed doors, about Todd Reeves's sudden absence, about the new policies that had begun trickling down from the top. Raises had appeared on pay stubs, and child care support notices had gone up on bulletin boards, and at the center of every whispered conversation was one name: Martha Williams. The overhead intercom cracked to life, cutting through the clang of machinery and the steady hiss of steam. "All employees, please report to the main assembly hall immediately." The voice was unfamiliar, crisp, professional, but the command was clear. Tools were set down, belts slowed to a halt, and workers began to move, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and uncertainty. Martha walked among them, her stride steady, her face calm, but her heart pounding. She felt the eyes on her, some curious, some confused, and a few with the old, familiar skepticism. She didn't blame them. After 30 years of being overlooked, she understood their doubt. But today, they would see something different. The assembly hall was a cavernous space designed for company announcements, though it had rarely been filled for anything meaningful. Workers lined the floor, their uniforms a patchwork of experience, some fresh, some worn thin from years of service. A low murmur filled the air, charged with anticipation. On the raised platform at the front stood Seth Harris, his presence stark against the backdrop of company banners and the polished steel logo that loomed overhead. Seth's eyes swept the room, taking in every face. He recognized some from reports, others from his recent tours of the floor, but most from the audit's painful pages. People who had given decades without recognition. People like Martha. The silence stretched, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried not just authority, but something heavier: conviction. "I asked you here because something has been broken in this company for far too long," he began, his voice cutting through the hall's expectant hush. "Brighton Manufacturing has built its success on hard work, the hard work of people standing right here. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what that work means. We stopped listening. We started taking. and we forgot that our strength isn't in machines or numbers, it's in you. A ripple moved through the crowd, skepticism, confusion, but also the stirrings of something warmer, hope. Seth continued, his eyes steady. No more. Effective immediately, we are raising wages for senior staff to reflect their experience and dedication, not just their time on a clock. We are establishing new support programs, child care assistance, emergency aid, and wellness benefits, because no one who gives their best to this company should have to struggle in the shadows. There was a shift in the room, murmurs growing louder, surprise, disbelief, cautious optimism, but Seth wasn't finished. And from today forward, promotions will be decided not by years on a page or favoritism behind closed doors, but by merit, experience, and the voices of those who know this floor best. He paused, letting the words land. Then his voice took on a new weight, and to ensure that those voices are heard, loud and clear, I'm proud to announce our first senior workforce advocate. Someone who knows this floor better than anyone. Someone who has carried this company long before I ever knew its worth. He turned slightly. Martha Williams. The hall seemed to freeze for a breathless second, and then it erupted. Applause broke like a wave, some loud and certain, others hesitant but growing. A few cheers rang out, raw and real. Martha felt her heart stop, then race. The spotlight fell on her, not a cold glare but a warmth, a recognition she had never expected and, in truth, had stopped hoping for. She moved forward, her steps slow but steady, and as she mounted the platform she felt the weight of 3 decades lift. Not erased, but carried differently. Seth stepped aside, and the microphone was hers. For a moment, she stood in the heavy silence left by applause, the crowd waiting. And then she spoke, her voice steady, clear, but carrying every line, every scar, every victory of the life she had lived. I've spent 30 years on this floor, she said, her voice low but strong. I've seen machines break down and people break down. I've seen men like Todd Reeves come and go, and I've seen the real heart of this company, the people, you, us. Her gaze swept the room, meeting familiar eyes. Some friends, some who had ignored her, some who had passed her over. I've watched this company reward the wrong things: speed over skill, youth over wisdom, power over people. That stops today, because this floor isn't just where we work, it's where we live. And if we don't stand together to fix it, no one will. A beat passed, and then her voice, worn but unwavering, cut through the air. So here's my promise. I will listen. I will fight. And I will make sure no one who gives their best to this place is ever invisible again. The applause came again, louder, longer. This time there was no hesitation. It rolled through the room, rising from hands that had built this company, from voices that had too long gone unheard. In the crowd, some faces remained tight. There were always those who resisted change. But many more had softened, the walls of old doubt beginning to crack. Some smiled, some nodded. And some, like a young woman near the back, felt a sudden spark of something long buried, possibility. Seth watched it unfold, his heart steady with something that felt almost like relief. This wasn't the end. There would be pushback, from the board, from investors, from every corner of the system that had kept people like Martha in the shadows. But he had learned something vital. Profit meant nothing without people. And change, real change, didn't come from behind a desk. It came from standing beside the people who made everything possible. As the applause thundered on, Martha turned slightly toward him, her eyes meeting his. There was no need for words. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, they were fighting it together. And in that moment, Brighton Manufacturing became something it had never been before. Not a company, a community. The days that followed felt like stepping onto a shifting landscape, unstable, uncertain, but alive with possibility. Change, Martha knew, was never smooth. The factory floor buzzed not only with machinery but with murmurs and questions. Some workers welcomed the raises and new policies with relief, while others eyed them with skepticism, waiting for the catch. Managers, stripped of their unchecked power, grew guarded, their eyes narrowing when Martha passed. She felt the weight of their resentment, years of privilege and convenience disrupted overnight. But she met their glances with the same steady gaze she had brought to every shift. She wasn't here to win their favor. She was here to fix what they had broken. The real work began not in meetings or speeches, but in the spaces where voices had been silenced for too long. Martha spent her days walking the floor, not as a manager, but as something more vital, a listener. She heard stories that felt like echoes of her own. Workers passed over for promotions, families struggling on wages too thin, shifts worked through sickness for fear of losing hours. She found younger employees too afraid to speak and older ones too exhausted to care. But she listened. She wrote everything down. And then she brought it to Seth Harris. In the executive offices, resistance flared quickly. Board meetings grew tense, filled with sharp questions and veiled accusations. Some called Seth's changes reckless. Others warned that shareholders were nervous, that the company's stock price was at risk. Projections showed rising costs, shrinking margins, and the pressure mounted for Seth to back down, to slow the reforms, to compromise. But Seth, his voice calm and his resolve absolute, gave them only one answer. We are not cutting corners. We are cutting rot. Martha sat in on some of those meetings, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. She didn't speak often. Her place wasn't behind the table, but beside the people it impacted. But when Seth did call on her, her words were sharp and clear. She told them about the nights she worked double shifts to keep her family fed. She told them about the faces behind every number they discussed, their exhaustion, their resilience, their worth. And when one board member, a man with polished shoes and a polished smirk, dared to suggest that such workers were replaceable, Martha's reply landed like steel against stone. If you believe that, you've never seen who really keeps this company running. People like me, we built this place. You just signed the papers. The room had fallen into a stunned silence. After the meeting, Seth told her he had never been prouder. But not every battle was fought in boardrooms. On the floor, some supervisors, bitter over their diminished power, began to test the limits. They shortened breaks, increased quotas, and pressed their teams harder, hoping to undermine the reforms through exhaustion and attrition. Complaints poured in, and Martha felt the familiar burn of frustration. But she didn't storm into Seth's office. She didn't fight this one alone. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She organized. It started with small meetings, quiet conversations during breaks, then larger gatherings after shifts. Workers from every line and department came, and together they began to share not just complaints, but ideas. The problems were clear, but so were the solutions, because no one understood the factory's pulse better than those who worked it. When the next round of complaints reached Seth, they didn't come as isolated voices, but as a collective. A detailed proposal drafted by the workers themselves, with signatures from across the floor. It was a blueprint for restructuring shift rotations, improving safety protocols, and addressing workload distribution. And Martha's name stood at the bottom, not as the author, but as a witness. Seth read every page, then called for a meeting with the workers' representatives, not as their CEO, but as their partner. And when he returned from that meeting, he carried not only their proposal, but his approval. Effective immediately, the new systems would be implemented, with workers participating in every review. The shift was seismic. Managers, stripped of their ability to rule through intimidation, began to see authority differently, not as power, but as responsibility. And on the floor, something rare and fragile began to bloom: trust. It wasn't perfect. No system ever was. But for the first time, the workers felt that the company listened with more than empty slogans. Months passed, and Brighton manufacturing began to transform, not from the top down, but from the inside out. Absenteeism plummeted. Productivity, which the board had feared would collapse, instead climbed steadily. Experienced workers, empowered rather than overlooked, began to pass down their knowledge with pride, raising the floor's efficiency without burning through new hires. And the company's reputation, once tarnished by whispers of exploitation, began to shift. But for Martha, the true measure of change came not in charts or figures, but in moments. She saw it when a single mother, whose voice had never reached beyond her station, was promoted to shift supervisor, a decision made by a committee that included her peers. She felt it when a veteran worker, once forced to hide his pain, received paid medical leave without fear of losing his job. She heard it in the laughter of younger workers who now believed they could build a future here, not just survive. One evening, long after the day's sounds had faded, Martha found herself back on the floor, the space dim and hushed. She traced her hand along the cool metal of the machines she had tended for half her life. The floor felt different now. Not just a place of labor, but a place of living. A place where what she gave wasn't just taken, but seen, valued, and returned. She heard footsteps and turned to see Seth approaching. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, a man who had fought every battle alongside her. He stopped beside her, and for a moment, they simply stood in the familiar quiet. "We've come a long way," he said softly. Martha nodded. Still a long way to go. Seth's lips curved into a small smile. "I wouldn't want to face it without you." Martha's eyes, lined with years of struggle and triumph, met his with something new: peace. "Good," she said simply, "because I'm not going anywhere." The factory lights, one by one, dimmed to darkness, but in that space something brighter had taken hold, something built from the ground up, forged in truth, and made to last. It wasn't a happy ending. It was something better, a new beginning. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more powerful narratives. Share this video with others who believe in fairness, resilience, and change. And don't stop here. Check out our other videos for more stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us all.